Newton had, in his very eclectic studies and his interest, had a very particular interest in things like the dimension of Solomon's temple. He had Maimonides on his bookshelf, translation at least, which he studied. Do we see this in Einstein at all?
Interesting. And the answer is yes and no. So in Newton's case, Newton was a mystic. Almost, you could almost see him, as a Kabbalist. He really thought that there was ancient knowledge that had been lost. Newton thought that his discoveries were known to the ancients, and he brought together, the ancient Greeks, the ancient Egyptians, and the ancient Hebrews in, a sort of weird twisting of history to believe that within the scripture really were these hidden truths that just needed to be worked out. We had to find the code to decode them. And so you had a sort of mysticism in Newton that you absolutely don't have in Einstein. So for Einstein, he has what he calls his cosmic religion. He really does believe that the universe is accessible to the rational mind, and that God, in essence, is the ultimate physics textbook, right? That is, the universe is governed by natural laws. But what do we mean by governed by? Well, a lawgiver who says that. So it's not an anthropomorphic God. It really is just the set of rules by which the universe is governed. And those will be purely rational. So you don't necessarily see appeals to earlier thought that way, that you would see in Newton. For Einstein, Judaism was something quite different. Now, he, for quite a while, both as a child and then as a young adult, really doesn't even claim a Jewish identity until all of a sudden he does. My two favorite stories here are, he got his first real academic position, not as an assistant, but as an actual professor in Prague. And as the family was crossing the border, he had to fill out all of the immigration forms, and there was a line that said religion. And in it, he wrote none, or objector. Now, the bureaucrat said, that's not a religion, you're Jewish, you have to write down Jewish. Einstein says, I'm not, I won't. And the bureaucrat says, well, if you don't write it down here, you can't have the job. And so Einstein says, fine, and he goes to leave. He was willing to give up what could have been the only offer in his academic career just so that he didn't write on a meaningless form that he was Jewish. Well, all of a sudden, the bureaucrat realized he's about to lose Albert Einstein for the country. This could be bad for his job. And so they negotiate an agreement. He will write down on the form, Mosaic. He will admit that he's of the people of Moses, but he's not Jewish. So he clearly at this point, like I say, he's an adult, he's a professor. But ultimately he gets a job back in Berlin, and he starts addressing Jewish groups using the pronouns we and us, where he clearly now is identifying himself as Jewish. And the question in the second book, Einstein in Space and Times, was what caused that change? We know that the compass and the geometry book led him at 9 and 10 to reject his Jewish identity. What, as an adult, led him back? And the answer is two things. The first is he had a lot of friends. I mean, he's Albert Einstein. Who doesn't want to be friends with Albert Einstein? When people ask me, anyone in history, who would you like to have dinner with? The answer is Einstein, of course. Everyone wanted to have dinner with Einstein. But he noticed a fundamental difference in his Jewish and non-Jewish friends, all of whom he loved, but even his Jewish friends who had converted, and a number had for pragmatic reasons, he just had a different relationship with them. There was something familiar. They laughed at the same things. That there was just an unspoken sort of communication, and he realized that no matter how much he tried, and he really saw himself as a person without a state, a citizen of the world. And yet he couldn't deny this feeling that there's just something at home with these people. And the other was that you saw at that time in Germany an influx of immigrants fleeing the pogroms in Russia, in Lithuania, and especially the Ukraine, where they were really horrific. And he would hear these stories. And of course, the German Jews weren't always the kindest to these Eastern immigrants. And Einstein was an empathetic person. And he saw in these people, he said, these are my kinsmen. And in solidarity with them, at the same time that the anti-Semites are labeling Einstein, he says, well, look, I can let the enemy do this, or I can do this myself. And so between those two realizations, he re-embraces himself as a Jew, but as, this is Einstein, his own kind.